Part 1. The Laughter. August 12th, 1944. The air inside the Wehrmacht command bunker, 30 kilometers east of Morton, hung thick with cigarette smoke and the acrid smell of burnt coffee. Outside, the Norman countryside trembled under Allied artillery fire. But within these concrete walls, decorated with operational maps marked in red and black grease pencil, German General Heinrich Eberbach stood before his staff officers, with something almost resembling amusement on his weathered face. He held a captured American operations order, the paper still crisp, the typewriter ink sharp against the white background. The document detailed supply requirements for the American Third Army advancing across France. Eberbach read aloud the figures: gallons of gasoline, tons of ammunition, rations for hundreds of thousands of men. And then he laughed. It was not the bitter laugh of a defeated man, but the confident chuckle of a professional soldier who believed he had identified his enemy's fatal weakness. His subordinates joined him, their laughter echoing off the bunker walls, mixing with the distant rumble of American tanks, that even then were punching through German defenses with a speed that defied everything the Wehrmacht had learned in 5 years of mechanized warfare. The Germans laughed because they knew logistics. They had studied it, lived it, suffered from its absence across the frozen wastes of Russia and the burning sands of North Africa. The German General Staff, that institution which had spent a century and a half perfecting the art of war, understood better than perhaps any military organization in history that battles were won, not just by courage or superior weapons, but by the unglamorous mathematics of supply. Every tank required fuel, every gun required shells, every soldier required food, water, medical supplies, replacement boots, letters from home. The further an army advanced from its supply depots, the longer and more vulnerable its supply lines became, stretched like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. This was the tyranny of distance that had broken Napoleon in Russia, that had strangled the German advance at Moscow in 1941 when their own trucks froze and their horses starved. And now, in the summer of 1944, as American forces exploded out of Normandy and raced across France at a pace that made even their own commanders nervous, the German generals looked at their maps, and they calculated. They measured the distances from the Normandy beaches to the German frontier. They counted the miles of road, the destroyed bridges, the bombed rail lines. They estimated fuel consumption rates and ammunition expenditure, and they concluded, with the certainty born of professional expertise, that the Americans were overextending themselves into a logistical catastrophe that would halt their advance more effectively than any German counterattack. This was not wishful thinking. This was mathematics backed by bitter experience. The average American infantry division in 1944 required approximately 650 tons of supplies per day to remain combat effective. An armored division needed even more, up to 750 tons daily. General George Patton'S Third Army, which had become operational on August 1st, consisted at that moment of 12 divisions advancing on a front that stretched across northern France. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Third Army required roughly 8,000 tons of supplies every single day just to maintain operations. Every gallon of gasoline consumed moving those supplies forward was a gallon that could not be used by the tanks and trucks doing the action.
If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more amazing love stories. Alright, back to the story.
Fighting. Every mile gained meant another mile of vulnerable supply line that German commandos or bypassed Wehrmacht units could attack. The German staff officers who studied these figures saw in them the inevitable conclusion to American ambition. The advance would slow, then stop, then collapse, as trucks ran dry and artillery fell silent for lack of shells. Then, with the Americans immobilized and vulnerable, the Wehrmacht could counterattack, could stabilize the front, could perhaps even drive the Allies back to the sea. It had happened before. It would happen again. The Americans, for all their industrial might and material abundance, did not understand war the way the Germans did. They did not understand that genius in combat meant nothing without the beans and bullets to sustain it. But what the German generals did not understand, what they could not understand because it fell outside their frame of reference and professional experience, was that they were not facing a conventional army supplied by conventional means. They were facing something new in military history, an industrial democracy that had transformed its entire national economy into a machine for projecting power across oceans and continents. The United States in 1944 was producing more war material than all other combatant nations combined. American factories were manufacturing one merchant ship every day, one bomber every hour, one tank every 10 minutes. This productivity was not just impressive in scale. It represented a fundamental difference in kind, a transformation of warfare from an art practiced by military elites into an industrial process driven by assembly lines and logistics networks. The Germans understood combined arms warfare, the integration of tanks and infantry and artillery and air power into a synchronized instrument of destruction. What they did not understand was combined industrial warfare, the integration of civilian production and military consumption into a single system that could sustain offensive operations at a tempo and distance that made traditional military planning obsolete. The laughter in that bunker in August 1944 was the laughter of men who believed they understood the rules of war, who had studied those rules at staff colleges and proven them in combat from Poland to Paris to the gates of Stalingrad. But they were applying old rules to a new game. They were calculating logistics, using formulas developed for armies that moved on railroads and horse-drawn wagons, for supply systems that depended on captured enemy stores and requisitioned civilian resources. They did not account for an enemy that could build entire ports from scratch when existing harbors were denied them, that could establish supply pipelines stretching hundreds of miles using vehicles manufactured by the tens of thousands specifically for that purpose, that could waste fuel and ammunition on a scale that would bankrupt any traditional military power, because waste was built into the system, absorbed as an acceptable cost of maintaining momentum. The Americans were not trying to sustain their advance despite logistical constraints. They were using logistics as a weapon, overwhelming German defensive capabilities, not just with firepower but with the sheer volume of material they could push forward even when traditional military logic said it was impossible. This divergence in understanding, this gap between what the Germans expected and what the Americans delivered, would define the campaign in Western Europe from the breakout at Normandy to the crossing of the Rhine. It was not primarily a story of tactical brilliance or operational genius, though both sides displayed those qualities at various times. It was a story about systems, about how the American military-industrial complex created supply networks that could support operational tempos that the Wehrmacht, for all its tactical sophistication, could not match or counter. And at the center of that system, embodying its contradictions and its unprecedented scale, was an improvised supply operation that would become legendary, a convoy line that would carry the name Red Ball Express and would fuel one of the most rapid advances in military history, while being crewed primarily by men whom the American military itself considered second-class soldiers, unfit for combat roles, relegated to support duties because of the color of their skin. But in August 1944, as General Eberbach laughed at American supply requirements and calculated the inevitable American halt, the Red Ball Express did not yet exist. It would be born from desperation, improvised in a matter of days, operated in violation of standard military procedure, and sustained through the kind of organized chaos that would have horrified German staff officers trained to value precision and efficiency above all else. The story of how and why it came to exist requires understanding not just the military situation in France in the summer of 1944, but the decades of planning and industrial development that had created American military logistics as a distinct discipline, and the racial tensions within American society that would determine who drove the trucks that carried the supplies that fueled the tanks that broke the German army. The foundation for American logistical superiority in World War II was laid not in 1944 or even 1941, but in the decades before the war, when the United States developed the industrial and organizational capacity that would prove decisive when conflict came. The American military entered World War I in 1917 with virtually no modern logistics system. The American Expeditionary Force in France depended heavily on British and French supply infrastructure, transport, even weapons. American soldiers often fought with foreign-made rifles and machine guns because American industry could not produce them in sufficient quantities fast enough. The experience was humiliating for a nation that prided itself on industrial prowess, and it led to 2 decades of study and development aimed at ensuring it would never happen again. The U.S. Army established specialized logistics schools. It developed doctrine for motor transport on a scale previously unimagined. It worked with American automobile manufacturers to design vehicles specifically for military use, not just combat vehicles like tanks, but the unglamorous trucks and transporters that would move supplies from ports to front lines. When war came again in 1939, the United States was not yet a combatant, but American industry was already mobilizing. The Lend-Lease program, which began funneling American war material to Britain and later the Soviet Union, served as a proving ground for American logistics. The United States learned to manage transoceanic supply chains, to coordinate production across multiple industries, to establish the bureaucratic and organizational structures necessary to track millions of individual items from factory to battlefield. By the time American forces landed in North Africa in November 1942, the United States had become what one historian would later call the arsenal of democracy, but arsenal implied merely production. What the United States had become was something more. It was a logistics empire, capable not just of producing war material but of delivering it anywhere in the world, and sustaining operations at distances that would have been inconceivable in previous conflicts. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, represented the culmination of this logistical planning. The Allied invasion fleet included not just combat vessels, but hundreds of specialized ships designed purely for supply operations. Combat engineers had prefabricated 2 entire artificial harbors, codenamed mulberries, that would be towed across the English Channel and assembled on the Norman coast to enable the offloading of supplies, even without capturing intact port facilities. The planners estimated that Allied forces would require approximately 15,000 tons of supplies per day during the initial phase of the invasion, increasing to 30,000 tons per day as more divisions came ashore. These figures were based on careful study of previous amphibious operations, adjusted for the scale of the Normandy assault and the expected rate of advance inland. The planners were wrong, not because they overestimated requirements, but because they underestimated the speed of the Allied advance once the breakout from Normandy began in late July. The Normandy campaign from D-Day through the end of July proceeded roughly according to plan. Allied forces secured the beaches, established a perimeter, gradually pushed inland against determined German resistance. The front lines moved, but slowly, measured in miles per week rather than miles per day. The logistics system kept pace. Supplies flowed from ships to dumps to forward units with acceptable efficiency. Then, on July 25th, Operation Cobra shattered the German defensive line west of Saint-Lô. American forces punched through the German positions and began advancing not in miles per week, but in miles per day, then miles per hour. Within 2 weeks, Patton'S Third Army was operational and racing across Brittany and toward the Seine. The distances involved were staggering. By August 15th, elements of Third Army had advanced over 200 miles from the Normandy beaches. By the end of August, advanced units were approaching the German frontier, having covered in 1 month distances that had taken armies in World War I 4 years of brutal attrition to traverse. This operational success created a logistical nightmare. The careful plans developed for a measured advance became obsolete within days. The artificial harbors at Normandy, marvels of military engineering, could not handle the volume of supplies required by armies advancing at this speed. The distance from the beaches to the front lines exceeded the capacity of the truck companies allocated to supply operations. Railroads in Normandy and Brittany had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing before D-Day and by German demolition teams during their retreat. The major port of Cherbourg had been captured on June 27th, but German engineers had sabotaged the facilities so thoroughly that the port would not reach full operational capacity until September. The other major ports needed to sustain operations, Le Havre, Brest, Antwerp, remained in German hands or were so damaged as to be unusable. The entire Allied supply system, designed to support a methodical advance through France over a period of months, was being asked to fuel a headlong rush that consumed supplies faster than they could be transported forward. The mathematics of the crisis were brutal and simple. By late August, Third Army alone was over 300 miles from the Normandy supply dumps. A truck making a round trip from the beaches to Third Army forward positions would travel 600 miles over roads damaged by bombing and heavy traffic, roads clogged with military traffic moving in both directions, roads that frequently came under German artillery fire or air attack. Each truck consumed gallons of fuel making that journey, fuel that could not be used to supply the combat units. The further the army advanced, the more fuel was consumed just maintaining the supply line, until the system approached a theoretical point where trucks would burn as much fuel transporting gasoline forward as they actually delivered. This was the logistical death spiral that the German generals anticipated, the inevitable mathematical conclusion that would halt the American advance, not through German military action but through the inexorable arithmetic of distance and consumption. The Allied High Command recognized the crisis. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, faced a decision that would shape the remainder of the European campaign. He could halt the advance, allow the logistics system to catch up, wait for ports to be captured and repaired before resuming offensive operations. This was the prudent choice, the choice that minimized risk and aligned with traditional military planning. Or he could attempt to sustain the advance despite the logistical impossibility, to keep driving toward Germany before the Wehrmacht could establish new defensive lines, to maintain the momentum that was shattering German resistance across France. This second choice meant improvisation on a scale that made professional logistics officers deeply uncomfortable. It meant stripping resources from other sectors. It meant accepting risks that could lead to catastrophe if German forces counterattacked successfully. It meant betting that American industrial capacity and organizational flexibility could overcome mathematical certainty. Eisenhower chose momentum. On August 21, 1944, the Allied High Command established what would be officially designated the Red Ball Express, named after the red ball symbol that American railroads used to denote high-priority freight. The Red Ball would be a dedicated truck convoy system running from supply dumps in Normandy to forward positions near the front lines. All other traffic would be prohibited from Red Ball routes during operational hours. Military police would enforce one-way traffic patterns to maximize throughput. Trucks would operate around the clock in continuous cycles. Load at the beaches, drive to the front, unload, return, repeat. The target was 6,000 tons of supplies delivered per day, a figure that logistics officers calculated was theoretically possible if every truck operated at maximum efficiency with minimal downtime. What those officers did not calculate, what could not be calculated in advance, was the human cost of operating vehicles at that tempo for weeks on end, the cumulative effect of exhaustion and mechanical failure, the improvisational genius and sheer stubborn determination that would be required to keep the system functioning when, by all rational measures, it should have collapsed within days. The trucks designated for Red Ball operations were primarily GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo trucks, the workhorses of American military logistics. The CCKW, known to soldiers as the Jimmy or Deuce and a Half, was not a sophisticated vehicle. It had no armor, minimal comfort features, a top speed of about 45 miles per hour under ideal conditions. What it had was reliability, durability, and compatibility with mass production. General Motors built over 560,000 of them during the war. They could operate on roads that would immobilize more specialized vehicles. They could be repaired with basic tools by mechanics with basic training. They were in every sense industrial warfare distilled into functional form, good enough for purpose, producible in massive quantities, maintainable under field conditions. Each truck could carry 5 tons when overloaded, which Red Ball trucks routinely were. Each truck required 2 drivers operating in shifts to maintain continuous operations, and crucially for the story that would unfold, each truck required men willing to drive them at the edge of exhaustion through a war zone where German resistance remained lethal, even as the main German defensive lines collapsed. The men assigned to Red Ball operations were primarily African American soldiers from segregated quartermaster truck companies. This was not by accident or random assignment. In 1944, the United States military remained strictly segregated by race. African American soldiers served in separate units, commanded primarily by white officers. They were generally excluded from combat roles, infantry, armor, artillery, and concentrated in support roles, quartermaster units, engineering battalions, port companies. The official rationale, such as it was, drew on pseudo-scientific racism that claimed black soldiers lacked the intelligence or courage for combat duties. The unofficial reality was simpler and more brutal. The American military reflected the racial attitudes of American society, and 1944 considered African Americans second-class citizens unsuited for positions of authority or responsibility. That this belief was demonstrably false, that African Americans had served with distinction in every American conflict since the Revolution, that the very quartermaster and engineering units where they were concentrated required precisely the intelligence and initiative that racist doctrine claimed they lacked. These contradictions did not trouble an institution built on tradition and resistant to social change. But the crisis in August 1944 created an opportunity, or perhaps necessity created opportunity. The logistics emergency required every available truck company, regardless of the race of its soldiers. More than that, it required sustained operations at a tempo that would test the limits of human endurance. The Red Ball Express would operate 20 hours per day, with only brief maintenance windows. Drivers would be expected to make multiple round trips per week, over routes that could exceed 600 miles. They would drive through territory where German forces still operated, where air attacks remained a constant threat, where accidents on war-damaged roads could be as lethal as enemy fire. These were not duties that could be ordered and expected to be performed with sullen compliance. They required dedication, skill, and a kind of stubborn pride in professional competence. The African American truck companies assigned to Red Ball operations possessed all three in abundance, and they would prove it in the weeks ahead in ways that would challenge the racial assumptions underlying their assignment to support roles in the first place. The first Red Ball convoys departed Normandy on August 25, 1944. The scene at the departure points would have looked like chaos to an outside observer, and in some ways it was chaos, but it was organized chaos, the kind of controlled confusion that characterizes military logistics under pressure. Trucks lined up by the hundreds, their canvas covers marked with the Red Ball insignia that gave the operation its name. Quartermaster personnel loaded the trucks with jerry cans of gasoline, crates of ammunition, boxes of rations, anything that combat units forward needed. The loading was not precise. There was no time for careful inventory or proper weight distribution. The goal was maximum tonnage moved at maximum speed. If some supplies were damaged in transit, that was acceptable. If some trucks were overloaded beyond their rated capacity, that was necessary. The alternative was American units running out of fuel and ammunition while German forces reorganized for counterattacks. Precision was a luxury that the situation did not permit. The drivers who would take these trucks forward came from truck companies that had trained together in the United States, had shipped overseas together, had operated together in England before D-Day, and in Normandy after. They were not strangers to each other or to their vehicles. Many had driven trucks in civilian life before the war. They understood the vehicles mechanically in ways that went beyond technical manuals. They knew how to coax extra performance from a worn engine, how to navigate damaged roads, how to perform field repairs that kept trucks operational when by-the-book maintenance would have condemned them to the motor pool. These skills would prove essential because the Red Ball operated under conditions that violated every principle of vehicle maintenance. Trucks ran overloaded continuously. Oil changes were delayed. Tire wear exceeded safe limits. Components failed and were replaced, or jury-rigged to keep trucks moving. The Red Ball was not sustainable in any long-term sense. It was a calculated sprint, an acceptance that trucks and men would be used up maintaining supply flow until ports could be captured and repaired, or until the advance halted. The routes themselves were marked with the Red Ball symbol painted on signs every few miles. Military police enforced strict traffic control. During operational hours, only Red Ball trucks were permitted on Red Ball routes. All other military traffic, including high-ranking officers, was diverted to secondary roads. This was necessary because the volume of trucks would have made the routes impassable otherwise. At peak operations, Over 5,000 trucks were assigned to Red Ball routes, with roughly half on the road at any given time while the other half loaded, unloaded, or underwent maintenance. The convoys stretched for miles, a river of olive-drab vehicles flowing east toward Germany, then flowing west back to the beaches for another load. The scale was unprecedented in military history. Never before had an army maintained offensive operations over such distances using motor transport as the primary supply method. The Red Ball was an experiment conducted under combat conditions, and its success or failure would determine whether the Allied advance could continue, or whether the German generals who had laughed at American logistics would be proven correct. The drivers experienced the Red Ball not as a historical phenomenon but as an endurance test that pushed them to and beyond the limits of human tolerance for exhaustion and stress. A typical Red Ball run from the Normandy beaches to forward positions near the German frontier took between 50 and 70 hours round trip, depending on road conditions, traffic, and mechanical problems. Drivers operated in pairs, theoretically alternating shifts so that one could rest while the other drove. In practice, rest was fragmentary and inadequate. The roads were rough, the trucks were not designed for comfort, and the constant noise and vibration made real sleep difficult even for off-duty drivers. Add to this the knowledge that German forces still operated in the region, that artillery fire could strike Red Ball routes, that Allied air superiority did not eliminate the risk of German air attack, and the result was a state of constant low-level stress, punctuated by moments of acute danger. The sensory experience of driving a Red Ball truck through France in August and September 1944 was overwhelming in its intensity and its monotony. The smell of diesel exhaust and gasoline fumes mixed with dust from the roads and the acrid odor of destroyed towns. The sound was a constant roar of engines, hundreds of trucks grinding through gears, the rattle of loose cargo in truck beds, the occasional crack of distant artillery fire. The landscape visible from a truck cab was a study in destruction: bombed-out buildings, burned vehicles pushed to the roadside, fields scarred by shell craters, occasional corpses, human or animal, that had not yet been buried or removed. The drivers saw all of this, processed it, and kept driving because there was no alternative. The cargo in their trucks, fuel, ammunition, food, was needed at the front. Every hour of delay meant American units that might run short of supplies. The abstract mathematics of logistics became concrete and immediate when you were the one transporting the supplies that would determine whether fellow soldiers ate or went hungry, whether tanks advanced or sat immobile for lack of fuel. The exhaustion was cumulative and progressive. After the first run, drivers were tired but functional. After the second, exhaustion began to affect judgment and reaction time. After the third and fourth, men were operating in a state of chronic sleep deprivation that would have been considered unsafe in any civilian context. But the Red Ball did not stop. There were no days off, no respite for exhausted drivers. When a truck returned to Normandy and unloaded, it was immediately directed to loading points for another run. The only break came when trucks required maintenance too extensive to be performed as field repairs, and even then drivers were often assigned to other trucks while their primary vehicles were serviced. The pace was unsustainable, but it only needed to be sustained for weeks, not months. That was the calculation. Use up trucks and men and supplies in a concentrated burst that would carry the Allied advance to the German frontier before the Wehrmacht could establish new defensive lines. Then, with ports captured and repaired, the supply system could revert to more sustainable operations. The statistics from Red Ball operations document the scale of what was accomplished. Between August 25 and November 16, when the Red Ball officially ceased operations and was replaced by other supply routes as ports became operational, Red Ball trucks transported approximately 400,000 tons of supplies to forward positions. This total included roughly 89 million gallons of gasoline, enough to fuel the tanks and vehicles that carried Allied forces from Normandy to the German frontier. The number of truck trips required to move this volume was staggering, over 130,000 individual convoy runs, each representing a round trip of hundreds of miles through a war zone. The trucks themselves traveled roughly 140 million miles in total, equivalent to more than 5,000 complete circuits of the Earth at the equator. These numbers are abstract, almost impossible to comprehend in human terms. but they represent the concrete reality of thousands of men driving trucks day and night for weeks on end, operating vehicles at the absolute limit of mechanical tolerance, improvising solutions to problems that would have halted operations under normal circumstances. The German generals who had calculated that American logistics would fail did not lack for intelligence reports about Red Ball operations. German reconnaissance units observed the truck convoys. German intelligence officers interrogated, captured American soldiers, and read captured documents. They knew about the Red Ball, knew about the volume of supplies being transported, knew that the Americans were sustaining operations over distances that should have been impossible. But this knowledge did not translate into effective countermeasures. The German military in late summer 1944 was fighting for survival, conducting a fighting retreat across France, while attempting to prevent the retreat from becoming a complete rout. German forces lacked the air superiority necessary to effectively attack Red Ball routes from the air. They lacked the mobile reserves necessary to mount ground attacks on the convoys. They were, in every practical sense, helpless to prevent the Americans from supplying their advance, even as German analysts correctly identified the supply line as the critical vulnerability in Allied operations. This helplessness must have been profoundly frustrating for German commanders who understood that they were losing not because American soldiers were better trained or more tactically proficient. The Wehrmacht generally maintained tactical superiority in individual engagements throughout the war, but because the Americans could bring overwhelming material superiority to bear, and could sustain that superiority over operational distances that made German counterattacks ineffective. A German counterattack might destroy a dozen American trucks, might capture a supply dump, might temporarily cut a supply route. These were tactical victories that made no strategic difference, because the Americans simply absorbed the losses and continued operations. The Red Ball lost trucks to accidents, mechanical failure, and enemy action at rates that would have crippled any traditional supply operation. Records indicate that roughly 30% of Red Ball trucks were out of service at any given time for maintenance or repair. Under normal circumstances, this would have been considered a catastrophic maintenance failure. In the context of Red Ball operations, it was acceptable because new trucks were available from reserve stocks, because replacement parts were abundant, because the system was designed to absorb attrition and continue functioning. This ability to absorb losses and maintain operations reflected a fundamental difference in how the Americans and Germans conceived of military logistics. The German military, shaped by generations of resource scarcity and fighting on multiple fronts with limited industrial capacity, practiced logistics as an art of efficiency and conservation. Every vehicle was valuable, every gallon of fuel was precious. Waste was not just discouraged but treated as a form of military incompetence. German logistics officers would have looked at Red Ball operations, the overloaded trucks, the accelerated maintenance schedules, the fuel consumed simply maintaining supply flow, and seen a system on the verge of collapse, wasteful and inefficient. And they would have been correct by their standards and their experience. But the Americans were not practicing German logistics with American resources. They were practicing a different kind of logistics entirely, one that accepted inefficiency and waste as acceptable costs of maintaining operational tempo. The mechanics who kept the Red Ball Express running operated in a state of controlled chaos that would have horrified peacetime automotive engineers. Every morning at the motor pools scattered along the Normandy coast, they faced the same brutal arithmetic. Hundreds of trucks returning from the front, each one battered by miles of rough roads in relentless use, each one needing to be back on the road within hours rather than days. The official Army maintenance manual specified detailed procedures for every repair, with time estimates measured in days or weeks. The mechanics of the Red Ball ignored those manuals. They had no choice. A truck with a blown engine could not wait 3 days for proper replacement procedures. It needed to be running by nightfall, or another truck would have to carry its scheduled load, which meant overloading that vehicle and hastening its own breakdown. The improvisations became legendary among the transportation battalions. Sergeants who had worked as shade tree mechanics in Georgia or Mississippi before the war brought skills never taught in Army technical schools. They learned to diagnose engine problems by sound alone, distinguishing between a worn bearing that might last another 1,000 miles and a cracked cylinder head that required immediate replacement. They developed techniques for cannibalizing parts from trucks too damaged to repair, creating supply chains that existed entirely outside official channels. A truck that had its frame bent beyond repair in an accident might donate its transmission, engine, axles, and electrical system to 4 different vehicles, extending their service life by weeks. The parts that remained, twisted metal and shattered glass, would be pushed into a ditch and forgotten, their official paperwork filed away as combat loss, with no questions asked about how a supply truck could suffer combat damage 200 miles from the nearest German position. The fuel consumption alone represented a logistical puzzle that bordered on the absurd. Each Red Ball truck could consume approximately 1 gallon of gasoline every 6 miles under optimal conditions. Optimal conditions never existed. The trucks ran overloaded, their engines laboring under weights that exceeded design specifications. They climbed hills in low gear, engines screaming. They idled for hours in traffic jams, burning fuel while stationary. The roads, deteriorating under constant heavy traffic, forced trucks to detour through fields and farm tracks where fuel consumption rates doubled or tripled. By conservative estimates, the Red Ball Express burned through 1 gallon of fuel to deliver every 5 gallons that reached the front lines. This ratio struck traditional logistics officers as catastrophically inefficient. German quartermasters, had they known the precise figures, would have calculated that the Americans were effectively throwing away 20% of their fuel supply just to transport the remaining 80%. But the American logistics planners had factored this waste into their calculations from the beginning. They had fuel to spare. The equation was simple. Better to waste 20% and keep the armies moving than to conserve fuel and watch the advance stop. The roads themselves became characters in the Red Ball story, evolving under the constant punishment of heavy traffic. Route Nationale 177, designated as the primary eastbound Red Ball route, had been built in the 1930s as a modern highway connecting Normandy to Paris. Its designers had calculated load-bearing capacity based on civilian traffic patterns: family automobiles, light commercial vehicles, the occasional heavy truck. Nothing in their calculations had anticipated 6-ton military trucks, loaded to 10 tons, passing in continuous convoy 20 hours per day. The pavement began to fail within the first week. Small cracks appeared, then widened under the relentless pounding. Water seeped into the cracks, undermining the roadbed. Sections of highway simply collapsed, creating craters that forced convoys to detour onto the shoulders, which then also began to fail under the weight. By mid-September, portions of the Red Ball routes more closely resembled dirt tracks than modern highways. The Army responded by deploying engineer battalions to perform continuous road maintenance, but the engineers were fighting a losing battle. They would repair a section of road, patching craters with gravel and broken stone, only to watch it disintegrate again within days under the constant traffic. The engineers developed a dark humor about their situation. They joked that they were not really repairing roads, but rather slowing the rate of deterioration, buying a few extra days before complete collapse. In some areas, they gave up on maintaining the original road surface and simply graded parallel tracks through adjacent fields, creating new routes that would last a few weeks before those too turned into impassable mud. French farmers, watching their fields torn up by military traffic, filed formal complaints with local authorities, who could do nothing except promise compensation after the war ended. The farmers learned to accept the situation with resignation. Better to lose a season's crops to Allied trucks than to remain under German occupation. The human cost of the Red Ball Express manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. The traffic accidents were obvious. Trucks that missed curves and rolled into ditches, head-on collisions when exhausted drivers wandered into oncoming traffic, vehicles that skidded on rain-slicked roads and jackknifed across highways. The official casualty reports documented these incidents with bureaucratic precision. Driver killed, vehicle destroyed, cargo lost. What the reports did not capture was the cumulative psychological toll of operating in a constant state of exhaustion and danger. Drivers developed a kind of fatalistic acceptance, a recognition that the next accident might involve them, but worrying about it served no purpose. They drove because driving was the mission, and the mission was all that mattered. The subtle costs appeared in the medical reports that tracked non-combat casualties. Drivers reporting to aid stations with symptoms that defied easy diagnosis: tremors, insomnia, digestive problems, unexplained pain. The medical officers, trained to treat combat wounds and infectious diseases, struggled to address what were essentially stress-related conditions in men who had never fired a weapon in combat. Some doctors prescribed rest, which was impossible given the operational tempo. Others offered sleeping pills to help drivers rest between runs, which created new problems when men woke up groggy and tried to drive. The medical establishment had no framework for understanding that logistical operations, conducted at sufficient intensity, could be as psychologically damaging as combat. The drivers were not dodging bullets or enduring artillery barrages, but they were operating under stress levels that exceeded sustainable human limits. The racial dynamics of the Red Ball Express created a parallel story that ran beneath the official narrative of logistical achievement. The African American soldiers who comprised the majority of Red Ball drivers found themselves in a peculiar position. They were performing work that was essential to the war effort, work that directly enabled the liberation of Europe, work that earned them genuine respect from the French civilians who saw them as liberators. Yet they remained second-class soldiers in the eyes of their own military. When Red Ball drivers passed through newly liberated French towns, they were often greeted with more enthusiasm than white combat troops, simply because the French associated the trucks with the material abundance that America represented. French children would run alongside the convoys, shouting "Vive l'Amérique" and begging for chocolate or cigarettes. French women would blow kisses and wave American flags. For men who had grown up in a segregated America where such displays of affection would have been dangerous or impossible, the experience was profoundly moving. But the racism did not disappear just because French civilians did not share American prejudices. The Red Ball drivers still faced discrimination from white American soldiers, and officer rest areas were often segregated, with separate facilities for black and white drivers despite the supposed exigencies of combat operations. Military police, tasked with maintaining order along the Red Ball routes, sometimes enforced these racial divisions with a zealousness that seemed to contradict the supposed importance of the supply mission. Black drivers who attempted to enter white rest facilities could find themselves facing discipline or even arrest, regardless of their exhaustion or their service record. The contradiction was stark and impossible to ignore. These men were good enough to drive trucks through war zones, good enough to keep the American advance moving, but not good enough to share a mess tent with white soldiers. Some black soldiers responded to this contradiction with anger, others with a kind of bitter humor, still others with a determination to prove their worth so decisively that even the most committed racist would have to acknowledge it. The Red Ball Express became a point of intense pride within the African American community, both in the military and at home. Black newspapers in the United States covered the Red Ball extensively, recognizing that it represented the first time that African American soldiers had been entrusted with a mission truly critical to American military success. Letters from Red Ball drivers to families back home carried a tone of satisfaction despite the hardships. They were tired, they were overworked, they faced discrimination, but they were also proving something important. They were demonstrating that Black Americans could perform as well as any soldiers when given the opportunity and the equipment. The food that sustained the Red Ball drivers became its own form of symbolic abundance. American military rations in 1944 were, by the standards of any other army in the war, absurdly generous. The standard field ration, the K ration, contained more calories than most European civilians had seen in a single meal since 1939. Each ration box included canned meat, biscuits, chocolate, cigarettes, and chewing gum. The variety was limited, and the taste was often poor, but the sheer quantity was staggering. Red Ball drivers, working at the physical limits of endurance, consumed multiple rations per day and still lost weight. They supplemented official rations with liberated items, fresh bread from French bakeries, cheese and wine traded from grateful civilians, fruit picked from orchards along the routes. The contrast with German soldiers, subsisting on reduced rations that often consisted of little more than black bread and thin soup, could not have been more stark. French civilians, encountering American rations for the first time, reacted with disbelief. The chocolate alone seemed like a miracle. Real chocolate, not their sat substitutes that had been common in occupied France. American soldiers, accustomed to complaining about the monotony of K rations, were puzzled by French enthusiasm until they understood how scarce such luxuries had become under German occupation. Some drivers began setting aside portions of their rations to give to French children, creating impromptu distribution networks that operated entirely outside official channels. A driver would arrive at a regular stop along the route and find children waiting, knowing from experience that the Americans would share their food. These small exchanges created bonds that transcended language barriers and military discipline. The drivers were not just delivering supplies to the front, they were demonstrating American abundance to a population that had nearly forgotten what abundance looked like. The cigarettes included in every ration became a form of currency more valuable than money. In liberated France, where tobacco had been scarce and expensive under occupation, American cigarettes could purchase almost anything. Drivers learned to accumulate cigarettes and trade them for services. A farmer would provide fresh eggs in exchange for a pack of Lucky Strikes. A mechanic would perform unofficial repairs in exchange for a carton of Camels. The French developed preferences for American brands, debating the relative merits of different cigarettes with the seriousness of wine connoisseurs. German soldiers, when captured, would often express more interest in American cigarettes than in their treatment as prisoners. The cigarette was perhaps the most perfect symbol of American industrial abundance, mass-produced, individually wrapped, distributed by the millions, and treated by American soldiers as essentially disposable items of minimal value. The mechanical durability of the GMC trucks became legendary through repeated demonstration under impossible conditions. The trucks were not sophisticated machines. They lacked the precision engineering of German vehicles or the elegant design of British lorries. What they possessed was a kind of brutal reliability, born from deliberate design choices. The engine was larger and more powerful than strictly necessary, which meant it could operate under stress without immediate failure. The transmission was simple, with fewer gears than European equivalents, which made it less efficient, but far less likely to break down. The suspension was deliberately over-engineered, capable of absorbing shocks that would destroy lighter vehicles. Every component had been designed with the assumption that maintenance would be deferred, that operators would exceed rated capacities, that the vehicles would be used in ways that violated every recommendation in the technical manual. This design philosophy reflected a fundamentally American approach to engineering. Build machines tough enough to survive misuse rather than demanding that users follow precise operating procedures. German vehicles were precision instruments that required skilled operators and regular maintenance. American vehicles were tools designed to function despite operator error and maintenance neglect. The difference reflected broader cultural assumptions about the nature of work and the relationship between humans and machines. German engineering valued craftsmanship and precision. American engineering valued reliability and ease of repair. Neither approach was inherently superior, but in the context of the Red Ball Express, where vehicles were being driven beyond their limits by exhausted operators with minimal maintenance support, the American approach proved decisively more effective. The drivers themselves developed an almost mystical relationship with their trucks, a bond forged through shared hardship and mutual dependence. A driver whose truck had carried him safely through thousands of miles developed loyalty to that specific vehicle, defending its quirks and compensating for its weaknesses with practiced skill. When mechanical failure finally forced retirement of a truck, drivers sometimes expressed genuine grief, as though losing a companion rather than a piece of equipment. Conversely, drivers assigned to unreliable trucks viewed them as adversaries to be fought against, obstacles to be overcome through willpower and determination. The truck that constantly broke down became a source of frustration and dark humor, cursed in language that would have shocked civilian sensibilities, but served as a necessary emotional release for men operating under impossible pressure. The weather added another layer of complexity to Red Ball operations. As summer gave way to autumn, September brought rain, cold, penetrating rain that turned dirt roads into rivers of mud and made paved roads slick and treacherous. Drivers who had struggled to stay awake during hot August days now struggled to stay warm in unheated truck cabs as temperatures dropped. The trucks themselves responded poorly to cold weather. Engines that had started reliably in summer required longer cranking in autumn. Radiators developed leaks as seals contracted in cold temperatures. Oil thickened, reducing lubrication and increasing wear on engine components. The maintenance crews added winterization to their growing list of tasks, draining cooling systems and replacing water with antifreeze, adjusting carburetor mixtures for cold weather operation, installing canvas cabin closures that provided minimal protection from wind and rain, but were better than nothing. The rain transformed the roads into hazards that challenged even experienced drivers. Visibility dropped to near zero during heavy downpours, forcing convoys to slow to a crawl or pull over entirely until storms passed. Standing water on road surfaces created hydroplaning conditions that sent trucks skidding off pavement. The mud that accumulated on tires reduced traction, turning corners into adventures and hills into ordeals. Drivers learned to watch for subtle changes in road surface, shifts in color or texture that might indicate hidden potholes or washouts. They learned to feel through the steering wheel and the seat of their pants how the truck was responding to the road, developing an intuitive sense of traction and stability that supplemented their visual information. The constant rain also affected the cargo itself. Supplies that had been loaded in dry conditions arrived at forward depots soaked through despite canvas covers. Cardboard boxes dissolved into pulp. Paper documents became illegible. Certain supplies, particularly ammunition and electronics, required protection from moisture that the standard truck covers could not provide. The logistics officers responded by prioritizing weather-resistant supplies for Red Ball transport, sending items that could tolerate exposure via truck while routing sensitive materials through rail lines as they became available. But rail capacity remained limited, which meant that Red Ball trucks continued to carry mixed loads that included both durable and fragile items. Drivers learned to inspect their cargo and adjust their driving accordingly. A load of gasoline and jerry cans could tolerate rough handling. A load of radio equipment required gentle driving and careful navigation of rough roads. The German response to the Red Ball Express evolved as understanding of its importance grew. Initial German reactions had been dismissive. Trucks were not tanks, supply operations were not combat operations, and resources devoted to attacking truck convoys were resources not available for defending against Allied assaults. But by late September, some German commanders recognized that the supply convoys represented a vulnerability that might be exploited. Small German commando units began targeting isolated sections of the Red Ball routes, setting up ambushes or planting mines on roads they knew American trucks would use. These attacks were pinpricks rather than serious threats, but they forced the Allies to divert combat troops to provide security along supply routes. Military police checkpoints became more elaborate. Infantry patrols swept sections of road ahead of convoys. Fighter bombers flew cover over supply routes during daylight hours. The attacks also had psychological effects disproportionate to their tactical significance. Red Ball drivers, who had viewed themselves as being in relatively safe rear area positions, suddenly had to confront the reality that they were potential targets. The distinction between combat troops and support troops blurred when German commandos might attack a convoy at any moment. Some drivers began carrying weapons beyond the standard issue pistol, acquiring rifles or carbines from sympathetic infantry units. Others focused on driving faster, reasoning that speed reduced vulnerability. The convoy speeds increased, which further accelerated wear on vehicles and roads, but also reduced exposure time to potential ambush zones. The logistics officers tracking Red Ball operations compiled statistics that told a story of sustained crisis temporarily resolved through sheer force of effort. The tonnage delivered increased week by week through August and early September, peaking at over 8,000 tons per day in mid-September. But the cost per ton delivered also increased as distances grew and road conditions deteriorated. The number of trucks required to deliver a given tonnage rose from an initial estimate of 1,500 to well over 6,000 by late September. The fuel consumed just operating the trucks approached 40% of total fuel delivered, a ratio that would have been completely unsustainable if the fuel shortage had not been the primary constraint on combat operations. As long as getting fuel to the front was the critical bottleneck, spending fuel to deliver fuel made strategic sense, however inefficient it appeared from an engineering perspective. The data also revealed patterns of adaptation and improvisation that occurred at every level of the operation. Drivers developed informal route modifications, identifying shortcuts or better roads and passing this information through word-of-mouth networks that updated faster than official maps. Mechanics created unauthorized repair procedures that reduced maintenance time from hours to minutes. Supply sergeants established trading networks with their counterparts at other units, swapping parts and supplies to circumvent official procurement channels that might take days or weeks to deliver needed items. The Red Ball Express succeeded not because it followed careful planning, but because the planning was flexible enough to accommodate and even encourage improvisation by the soldiers actually performing the work. This culture of improvisation stood in stark contrast to German military practice, where deviation from established procedures was viewed with suspicion and discouraged through rigid chains of command. German efficiency depended on everyone following the same rules and procedures, creating predictability and standardization. American efficiency, at least in the context of the Red Ball Express, depended on empowering individual soldiers to solve problems creatively within broad mission parameters. Neither approach was universally superior, but in a fluid, rapidly changing situation like the Allied advance across France, the American model proved more adaptable. Problems that would have required a German unit to request guidance from higher headquarters were solved by American sergeants and corporals making decisions based on immediate circumstances and local knowledge. The symbolic power of the Red Ball Express extended beyond its military function to shape perceptions of American power and character. For Allied soldiers from other nations, British, Canadian, Free French, the endless convoys of American trucks represented both reassurance and mild resentment. Reassurance, because the abundance of American supplies made victory seem inevitable. Resentment, because American material superiority highlighted British and French industrial limitations. British officers, accustomed to making do with limited resources and viewing such constraint as evidence of superior character, sometimes expressed disdain for American wastefulness, but they also requested assignment of American trucks and supplies when possible, recognizing that moral superiority did not win battles against well-equipped German forces. For the Germans, the Red Ball became a source of dark fascination and creeping demoralization. Intelligence reports describing the scale of American logistics operations were initially dismissed as exaggerations or propaganda, but as evidence accumulated, captured supply manifests, interrogations of prisoners, reconnaissance observations, German commanders were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. They were not losing because their soldiers lacked courage or their tactics were inferior. They were losing because they were fighting an enemy that could absorb losses that would cripple any European military and continue operations without pause. The Wehrmacht could win a battle, could destroy an American unit, could capture supplies and equipment, and none of it mattered strategically because the Americans simply replaced everything and kept advancing. This realization spread through German ranks in the autumn of 1944, corroding morale more effectively than Allied propaganda could have managed. German soldiers who had believed they were fighting for a cause, however misguided, began to understand they were simply delaying an inevitable defeat. The trucks, rolling endlessly through France and Belgium, visible in reconnaissance photographs and intelligence reports, became symbols of that inevitability. Some German units began surrendering more readily, calculating that continuation of resistance served no purpose except to increase casualties. Others fought with increased desperation, understanding that defeat was certain but clinging to duty or ideology. The Red Ball Express, in this sense, was not just a logistics operation, but a psychological weapon demonstrating Allied power in a form more comprehensible and demoralizing than battlefield victories.